Ladies and gentlemen, welcome along to Too Many Games, and today we're going to have a look at tournament style games and how you play Epic Armageddon in that sense. We've already covered all the rules going through how to play the game, but you might just need that little extra help on how to start, how to set up that game. This is not how to run a tournament, it's more so how to play a tournament style game. Where do you start? Well, there's a lot of obvious stuff that you probably do when you're first looking into Epic Armageddon. You choose the army that you want to play, you find the army list for it and go through it. You probably have some models, or you get some models, or proxy in some models that go with that army. You're going to need to have some terrain so you can set up a board to play with. And probably most importantly, you need to find someone to play against. But where do you go after all that obvious stuff? Well, in choosing your forces, both players, to play a game of Epic Armageddon, choose an army generally between 2,000 to 5,000 points. You can go outside this size, but this is generally the recommended size between there. I usually play around 3,000. If you go a bit above 5,000, you might find that it's just too long and the board might get too congested. And if you go below 2,000, it might just be a bit wonky and not work as intended. There's a whole lot of army lists available on the Net Epic Armageddon website listed there. Just do a search for it, you will find it. There's a lot of supported and regularly updated lists on there, which are great. But you will find other lists on the internet or on other websites, other forums. Check with your opponent if you're not sure. If it's an older list, perhaps it hasn't been supported in a long time. Just make sure you're not going to play something that might be a bit unfair to your opponent. In that army list, you'll have rules and guides as to how to build it and how to play it. So follow those rules when choosing your forces and putting your list together. Setup: you need a board, a 6x4 board, which is roughly 180 centimeters by 120 centimeters. That's the standard size table. Again, you can play on different, but that gives you a fair bit of space to maneuver, which is always helpful to get the most out of Epic Armageddon. Particularly anything above 3,000 points, you might find that even a 6x4 board can be a bit congested. It's played with terrain, and the rules actually do provide some suggestions as to how you set up the terrain and what you use. You have terrain features, which are just basically pieces of terrain, somewhere between 15 to 30 centimeters across. That piece of terrain is generally accepted, and you divide the board into 2-foot squares, so 60 centimeter squares, and then you go through and you place anywhere from 0 to 4 terrain pieces in each square. So you split the board up, and then you add terrain pieces into each section. That generally gives you a nice spread across the board. You're free to change that however you want, and you'll find that as you play more, you'll just set up a board knowing roughly what's good and what works and what doesn't. But if you need some guidelines on it, that's a helpful start. If you're using a river, it's recommended you only have one river, and it starts on one edge and exits on another. Again, that's not something we play with that often, but it can be a nice little terrain piece and affects the movement of vehicles. Any number of roads can be placed on the board, but do it after other terrain, and generally they have to kind of make sense. They have to enter at one edge and exit at another, or end at a feature somewhere at some piece of terrain. So it's not just a road section starting nowhere, going nowhere. Make it look good, make it thematic, and make it helpful to the game. Who chooses their side for deployment on the board? Because obviously you've got to choose. Listen, sort it out however you want to sort it out. I mean, there are some helpful options with that. If someone sets up the terrain, generally it's nice if the other person then chooses their board edge, just to stop any placement of terrain that might be a bit unfair or one-sided. If you set it up together, then just look at who's got the highest strategy rating, and they can choose their side first. If it's an equal strategy rating, then just dice roll and go from there. The player choosing first chooses one of the long board edges or a corner, and a corner is halfway up on a short edge and a long edge, and the opponent will take the opposite side. For the longest time, we didn't even realize that you could choose a corner, and it changes the game quite a bit when you actually do start using corner deployments. The 5-minute warm-up, we talked about this in our rules section, the 5-minute warm-up that happens before the game. It's basically just taking a few minutes to discuss terrain and any rules or rules interactions with your opponent, so that you're not having most of those discussions partway through the game, and asking questions that affect strategy later on when it's probably a bit too late. Certain things to discuss, and we'll go through an FAQ in a minute to ask a whole lot of questions, but the counts as units, discuss them. So if you've got any proxies, work out what they are. There's old Epic models that are official Epic models that are no longer supported in Epic Armageddon, but they might count as something else, or it could be third parties or 3D prints. Just make sure everyone knows what is what and that it's appropriate. Talk about line of sight, line of fire, check your understanding on any terrain pieces that might be a bit hard to understand how that will work. Firing arcs on units, discuss that where applicable. Pre-measuring, what do you both understand by pre-measuring? What's accepted between you? You don't want to fight to break out halfway through the game. Templates, talk about if units are in or out when it comes to templates. Do they have to be wholly under or just partly under? Terrain, make sure all the terrain's discussed. What is it? What does it count as? How does it work? Let's understand how that's going to work with infantry, that kind of stuff. How do you represent things? Broken, Overwatch, marching? Do you have tokens? Do you what way do you do that? Just make sure each other is understanding of how the other person plays. And any other house rules. You find a lot of these games, you end up just adopting house rules that you and your mates might accept, but then you go play someone else and they play exactly by the rules, and it can throw you off. So just make sure you work that out. If you have good house rules, it's also a time to share with someone else, and they might adopt those house rules because they could be really good. FAQ. So, is there a complete list of what to cover in the 5-minute warm-up? Here is the complete list. It goes on a bit. You don't have to go through a lot of this, but if you are a person that wants that guide, they give it to you in there. So, here's some questions to ask and to think through. Should you dice for each ability used at the start of the turn? Are transported units considered to be in specific transporting units of their formation? That can definitely matter if there's characters and things like that. When disembarking, are transported units placed completely within 5 centimeters or just so part of the transported units within 5 centimeters? So there's these rules interactions that we've seen in our FAQs where it just kind of deferred to the 5-minute warm-up. It didn't make a ruling on it. This is the time where you make a ruling on it with your opponent, just so that you understand when it gets to that point of unloading or disembarking troops, you know exactly what's expected. When does a unit count as being in cover? And this is a great time to talk about it with the actual terrain that you have set up. How many units can claim cover from an armoured vehicle, war engine or terrain feature? Does the charging formation need to get within 15 centimetres of the original target? Or can it get within 15 centimetres of any intermingled formation? Again, these are some of the more complex rules questions that we've had. If you have regular opponents, you won't need to discuss these every time, but probably good to bring them up at some point. How are attacks with special abilities like Ignore Cover and Lance allocated in Assault? Can a war engine countercharge if it has enemy units in base contact? Again, all questions that aren't clear in the rules or the FAQs necessarily. Is it possible to air assault into a formation which is completely covered by the zone of control of another formation? So again, another rules interaction which is unclear. Where should measurements for capturing, contesting an objective be made from? Is it the center? Is it from any part of that token that you might be using to represent it? Any other house rules you normally play with? Any counts as rules as we've talked about? And it's always helpful, I think, is what is your army capable of? Units, weapons, and special rules. I think it's a good sporting decision to actually talk through what your army can do. Don't trick your opponent, don't surprise them, don't win the game because they were completely unaware of a special ability your army has. I think it's good just to talk through, even if it's roughly going, this is what I've taken, this is what it can do, this is my army special rules. Okay, coming to placing objective markers, and this is important, and you'll see right at the end of the video, so hopefully stick around to the end. We'll go on the how to win the victory conditions, and it comes around your objective markers a lot. So, how do you place them? You take turns placing objective markers until 6 are placed. So each player, so in a 2-player game obviously, will get 3 objective markers to place on the board. The highest strategy rating will go first, as normally, and Dice off for ties as normal. The first objective a player must place is on their own board edge. So let's assume you're using the long board edge. You will place that on your own long board edge. The second and third objectives that you place, so remember you take it turn for turn with your opponent, you have to place these in your opponent's half of the board. So the first objective on your board edge in your half, the second and third in their half of the board. But it has to be at least 30 centimeters away from the opponent's board edge, so you can't put it right at the back of the board, and it has to be 30 centimeters away from another objective. Let's have a look at an example here in this beautiful green board that I've set up. Objective markers. Let's say you place your first one down and your board edge is the top edge there, and you place that on your board edge. Nice. Your opponent would then place one on their deployment edge. You place your second marker in their half, but it has to be 30 centimeters away from their board edge, and from another objective marker. They place one in your half, you place another in their half, and then lastly they place another. And there are a lot of strategy and tactics that go into placing objective markers. When you first start playing, you'll just throw down, but as you start to realize what your army can do, which victory conditions you prefer to go for, what terrain is on the board, there are a lot of interactions that will cause you to set up your objective markers in different ways. It can even get to a point where people can use objectives to, like a webway portal in some of the armies, to bring out their formations from there, so it might actually affect how you place these. So there's a lot that goes into this part. But as you see there, 6 objectives, you place 1 on your board edge, 2 in the opponent's half. How do you capture these objective markers? The objective marker is captured if you have a unit, not a formation, just a single unit within 15 centimeters in the end phase. So you check in the end phase. It's contested if both players have at least one unit within 15 centimeters. You don't count to see who outnumbers the other person. It's just if both players have at least one unit, it's contested. However, units in broken formations or formations that rallied in that end phase cannot capture or contest. So if you're broken, you don't count. If you were broken but you just rallied, you also don't count. Landed aircraft, so if you've come into land, cannot capture on the turn that it landed, so you can't just swoop in and capture it. However, they can contest. So that's a little side exception to the rule, I guess, there, saying that they can land somewhere and they'll be able to contest your objective. Check on the total that has been captured at the end of each turn. Now again, for first and second turns, as we'll see after, it's not really important, but it will be something that you're paying close attention to on turn 3 and 4. And you need a unit to remain in the 15 centimeters for that objective to be considered captured still. You don't capture it once and then move away and it's still yours. You have to have someone there physically to exert your control over that objective. FAQ time. Can the player with the highest strategy rating choose to make their opponent place first? No. If you've got the highest strategy rating, you will be placing first, so you could see that as a negative, but generally the highest strategy rating is a huge advantage in Epic Armageddon, so take it on the chin, but you also chose your deployment zone first too, so you get a lot of good stuff with that higher strategy rating. How big can objective markers be? As big as you like is the answer. Just remember that they're a marker, and as such don't count as terrain or block a line of fire. We generally use a 25 to 28 mil kind of marker just to do them, but you can have bigger than that. And again, we saw in the 5-minute warm-up, you're supposed to talk to your opponent about how do you capture them, where are you measuring from. Where should measurements for capturing contesting objective be made from? And as I just preempted there, talk about it in the 5-minute warm-up. For objectives placed on a table edge, most groups measure to the center of the area that touches the table edge, while all other objectives are measured from their center or a designated point. I think measuring from the center is probably the easiest. That way it lets you let you go a bit crazy. Some people like to do real thematic kind of objective markers that they've made that are 3D, and they count as tokens. They don't have any impact on the game, but they look really cool, and it's just good if you measure from the middle. Okay, you then set up your spacecraft. So you set up spacecraft before any other units that you're going to deploy, and units entering via planetfall should be set aside at this time as well. You then set up your garrisons. So after spacecraft, you do garrisons. What's a garrison? Well, some formations can be set up on the board in an advanced position. So your garrisons are the formations that you have already deployed outside of your deployment zone, further up the board essentially. Only some of them can be. So you need a formation where 50% or more are scouts in order to do it, or formations where maximum of one unit with greater than 15 centimeters move and with no war engines. So you can have a formation where only one of the units has more than 15 centimeter move, but they could still garrison. So a lot of infantry can garrison, provided you don't have a war engine in there. Or any formations with a unit with a 0 centimeter move. So if there's a particular unit that has 0 centimeters, you can set them up. Usually they're an immobile kind of formation anyway, but they're the three kind of things you have to satisfy generally to be considered eligible to garrison. It's good for scouts setting up a bit closer. It's good for big infantry blocks maybe that don't have transport, just to start up the board a bit further. What are the restrictions for this? Well, you set them up one at a time. So, you can't just set all yours up. You must have one unit in that formation within 15 centimeters of an objective in your own half. So remember, the objectives in your half, you haven't placed, your opponent has placed. So you can set up your garrison units, but formations, but one of the units there has to be within that capture kind of range of the objective. No units can be set up in the opponent's half of the board or in impassable terrain. So you can't set up right up the board. You can't get that advantage of maybe a first turn assault. You're going to set up in your half of the board still, but outside of your deployment zone potentially. You may be set up in dangerous terrain, which is helpful because you don't have to test to get into it. 2 garrisoned formations may also be set up on Overwatch, and this is a pretty helpful thing because they might be setting up and be a little bit exposed, so it's nice if they can have the opportunity to blast away at anyone that might be coming up to harass them on turn 1. FAQ time for our garrisons. Can the player with the highest strategy rating choose to make their opponent set up a garrison first? As we've seen before, no. Just take it on the chin. Can war engines garrison? And so the answer is only if they're in a formation that includes units with speed of 0 or immobile, or if they are in a formation where half or more of the units rounding up are scouts. Because we saw on that previous page, one of the restrictions was they couldn't have war engines in that formation. But if you're in the scouting formation or the immobile one, you can. Can a transport aircraft garrison? No, they must be kept in reserve. So you can't have a Thunderhawk full of guys start up landed on the board or something like that. You then move on to setting up your remaining formations, and you set up your formations within 15 centimeters of your own board edge. So your deployment zone is essentially 15 centimeters onto the board from your edge. You take turns, one formation at a time, and once again, the highest strategy rating starts that off. Your reserves and planetfall formations. So before this, declare which formations are in reserve and not set up with the remaining forces. This is open information, so it's not a surprise. It's not a trick to go, no, sorry, these ones are actually off. Units in reserve must be aircraft or entering play via aircraft transport or by teleportation. So remember, they have to be clearly told to your opponent that they're coming in on aircraft or teleporting. Units in transports starting the transport, bringing them in. And formations entering via aircraft or spacecraft can do so on any turn. So you can start off in an aircraft and land them on turn 1. Formations in reserve have no effect on the game, no special abilities, etc. that come into play, so they're out of the game completely. FAQ time. Are formations being kept in reserve declared at the same time as other formations are being set up within 15 centimetres of their own side's table edge? No. Players declare which formations are going to be kept in reserve first, then take it in turns to set up remaining formations one at a time, starting with the player with the highest strategy rating. So you declare what's off the board before you place any of those leftover units on the board. So your garrisons are set up, but before you deploy the bulk of your forces, you'll actually declare this is all starting off, and your opponent will then be able to go, oh, okay, he has or she has these formations starting on. Can the player with the highest strategy rating make their opponent set up a formation first? No, we know that. Stop asking it. It's obviously a frequently asked question. No, take it on the chin. When is it decided how formations in reserve will enter play? The means by which a formation will be entering play must be declared when they are declared to be in reserve. And this could come into play with a formation that could go into a transport or could teleport in, for example. So you have to let them know these are coming in and this is how they're coming in when you set them up off the board. Can formations that aren't aircraft or entering play via transport aircraft or teleportation be kept in reserve? Yes, but only if they can enter play via some other special ability like Tunneler, Self-Planetfall, insert your special ability there. So you can't just keep them in reserve for no reason. There has to be some way that they can get on. Can a formation in reserve activate? Yes, and it must enter play. So if you activate it, it's coming in. FAQ time. Is a formation in reserve ever limited in what actions it can carry out? So yes, it must carry out an action that will allow it to enter play. Sometimes it might be limited to carrying out an engage action. Example, Eldar in reserve with a webway portal in an enemy's unit's zone of control. The only way you could come in that case would be to actually assault the unit that's got their zone of control over your webway. But again, kind of corner cases for a lot of us. Must a formation in reserve activate? So no, but you may only choose to pass on activating a formation if all unactivated formations for the turn are in reserve. So if someone's in reserve, you don't have to activate them, because if you do activate them, they have to come on, as we just saw from the previous FAQ question. But you can't use them as a freebie to pass on an activation. You can only pass after everything else has been activated. And we're still going with the FAQs. There's a lot of them. Can a formation in reserve with no means to enter play choose to pass? Example, Necrons in reserve with no portal left to use. No. So you can't choose them to pass because there's no possible way for them to get in. What happens when a formation in reserve fails its action test? It must move as part of a hold action to enter play. So it's a hold action, but you're just doing the movement part of that hold action in order to enter play. So you can't then go on and shoot and things like that. What happens when a formation in reserve fails its action test but can't enter play? Eldar in reserve and webway portal, as we saw before. It takes a blast marker and may not take a hold action. It effectively loses its activation. So if you do fail and you can't activate, you can't come on the board at all. You still get that blast marker, which is important to remember, because when you do come on, or next turn, you'll have a blast marker on that formation. Victory conditions. This is potentially the most important part of understanding Epic Armageddon, how to win, how to actually defeat your opponent, because it's not about just getting on the board and blasting them off, although let's be honest, that will help you with your victory. But there's a lot to consider around how to actually win. And this is essentially, I think, one of the really good parts of Epic Armageddon is you've got these objectives that stay the same from game to game, but there's a lot of ways to achieve victory. So victory for both players is checked at the end of turn 3 and 4. So it's a 4-turn game. Turn 1 and 2, you're not checking for victory, so you might be setting up your victory, but you're not going to get defeated real quickly. Turn 3 or turn 4 is where you may win or you may be defeated. If no player wins, it goes to a tiebreaker, so that's after turn 4. You have 5 goals to achieve, and if you achieve at least 2 in the end phase and more than your opponent, then you win. So there are 5 things you can achieve in this game. You need to achieve at least 2 to win, and it has to be in the end phase, that's when we check it. But if your opponent's also achieved 2, well, you don't win. If you've achieved more than them and you've achieved at least 2, so maybe you've achieved 3 and they've achieved 2, then you will defeat them. So this is what you're trying to do. 5 of these. First one, Blitzkrieg. You're trying to capture the objective on your opponent's board edge. So this is the furthest objective away from your deployment zone, basically. This is the one they set up on their own board edge. If you capture that, that counts as one of your 2 goals that you need. So, but generally that's a harder one to capture because you have to get through their entire force. You've got defend the flag. So this is where you control all 3 objectives in your own half. So this includes the one that you placed on your board edge, plus the 2 that your opponent placed. If you control all 3 of those on turn 3 or 4 at the end, that counts as one of your victory conditions. Or take and hold. This is where you control 2 objectives in your opponent's half. And note that it doesn't specify which 2 in your opponent's half. They might be the 2 objectives that you set up, but it could be 2 objectives, one of which is the opponent's board edge objective. So take and hold and Blitzkrieg kind of marry up in that sense. If you control their opponent's board edge objective, that counts for Blitzkrieg and could also count as one of the 2 for take and hold. So take and hold, 2 objectives in your opponent's half. Break their spirit, so this is not using objective markers, the first 3 were there. Break their spirit is where you destroy the enemy formation worth the most points, so their most valuable formation essentially. Now you must destroy that formation, not break it. So you have to totally wipe it out. If it's still there on the board, it still counts. But as we've seen in Epic, if they're broken, they're easier to kill generally. If tied for highest points, so maybe there's 2 formations the same cost, you can destroy either of them. So that's good, you get the choice. And lastly, number 5, they shall not pass if there are no unbroken enemy formations in your half of the board. So think of this as you've kept them outside of your half, basically. If they have broken formations in your half, oh well, doesn't matter, doesn't affect this. So as long as you've kept all the ones that aren't broken outside of your half, you can win on this one too. And this will obviously marry quite well with maybe keeping your 3 objectives in your half. So they're the 5 victory conditions, and you need 2 of those at the end of turn 3 or 4. If there is a tiebreaker after turn 4 and you haven't been able to achieve victory, both players will roll a dice, and if the numbers are equal on those dice, you play another turn. So that's equal. So if you both roll a 3, you play on, but it doesn't matter who rolls higher. If not, then you will calculate the points and the highest score will win. So you could go to a turn 5, but you may just go to calculating points for the game. How do you calculate those points? Okay, well, your total score in victory points equals, and there's a couple of things to go through here, so it's helpful to maybe look back at this if you're doing this. The total value of any enemy formations fully destroyed, you score in points. So if you've fully destroyed someone, you get the full value for them. You get the total value for any enemy formations that are broken at the end of the game and are reduced below half strength. So you've almost destroyed them. So you get the total value for both of those. They're destroyed or they're broken and almost destroyed. You get half the value for any broken formation above half strength. So half points essentially for anyone that's broken at the end, but they're still in pretty good shape. They're above half strength. And you get half the value for enemy formations that are reduced below half strength and not broken. And that's a tricky one to remember, I've found. So you get half points for them because you almost destroyed them, but they're not even broken at the end of the game. So have a look back. I find most games don't go to a tiebreaker. You usually plays out by turn 4, and someone's managed to get more objectives than the other. But if it happens, this is how you do it. Formation strength, so that's important to know, equals the number of remaining units plus the remaining damage capacity of war engines. So you're comparing the formation strength now compared to when you first started the game. All right, some FAQs. Do formations that are off the board, such as Spacecraft, or in reserve, haven't been brought on maybe, count towards the break their spirit goal? And the answer is no. However, a formation that enters play and is destroyed, such as an aircraft, will count towards the goal. So again, just if they're off the board, it doesn't mean their count is destroyed. Does a whole formation have to be on the opponent's half of the table to deny the they shall not pass goal? A whole unit? One part of a single unit on the opponent's half of the table is all that it takes to deny them the they shall not pass goal. And I've found it can be a really hard objective to have, just because it's so easy for them to sneak one unit onto your side of the board. And if you haven't broken that formation, then, oh well, they've denied that from you. So it's a real tricky one to win on. If a formation rallies in the end phase, can it deny the opponent the they shall not pass goal? And the answer is yes. Yes, they can. So you can't capture objectives if you rally, but that is now a rallied unit. It's back in the fight, and so it counts as being in their half. And that brings us to the end of another video on Too Many Games. Hopefully that gave you a bit of idea of how to actually play the game of Epic Armageddon. There's a lot in there. I'd probably start by just going through and setting up with your opponent, taking it step by step. The important thing, and the thing that might be a bit tricky, is just remembering all the objectives that you've got and what you're trying to achieve in the game. But once you get your head around that, you find that it really adds a lot of replayability, and just makes Epic Armageddon a great game to play. Anyway, like, subscribe, keep an eye out. I've got some more videos coming very soon. Thanks for watching.